My name is Adeline Turner. I'm 28 years old and a history teacher at a small public school in Colorado. My life had always been quiet, monotonous, like the pages of an old book, until the day my grandfather passed away. During the funeral, as the mournful hymns echoed through the stone chapel and candlelight cast soft shadows across the cold walls, a strange woman walked up to me. No one else seemed to notice her, only me. In her hand was a brown envelope, sealed with red wax. She placed it into my palm and whispered, "Your grandfather left this for you. Only you are meant to know." I opened the letter. Inside was a string of bank codes, printed account statements totaling over $29 million, and one line handwritten in black ink. "Don't trust anyone in the family. Not even your mother." My heart tightened. Not because of the staggering amount of money, but because he, my most beloved grandfather, had left behind a secret I wasn't ready to face. Have you ever stood at a loved one's funeral only to realize you've lived your whole life not knowing the truth? If you've ever been betrayed or kept in the dark by someone you love, share your story in the comments. Hit like if you believe trust is worth more than any inheritance. And subscribe to the channel to follow my journey into the legacy my grandfather left behind, and the secrets that could tear a family apart. This story isn't just about money. It's about choosing between family and justice. And I had to choose. I still remember clearly that first summer day when my mother dropped me off at my grandparents' ranch in the northern mountains of Colorado. I was only 5, my braid lopsided, clinging to a stuffed bunny, tears still wet on my cheeks. My mother, Tracy, unbuckled me, set me on the gravel, and rushed back to the driver's seat. She didn't hug me. She didn't look back. She said only one thing: "You'll be fine. I have a flight." Then the car sped away, leaving behind a trail of dust and a silence so heavy it rang in my ears. But Grandpa Eugene didn't let me stand there long. He opened his arms, bent down to my eye level, and said in a warm, steady voice, "Well, there's my little lady. Come on in. There's fresh apple pie cooling on the counter." Grandma Margaret stood on the porch steps in her apron, smiling as softly as the sunlight. The smell of butter and cinnamon drifted through their old wooden kitchen. And I, a child with no one waiting for me after school, had finally found the first place where I truly felt loved. From then on, every summer of my childhood began and ended at that ranch. It spanned over 70 acres tucked between pine forests and grassy hills, with a 3-bedroom log house, a small horse barn, and rows of carrots, zucchini, and sweet corn grown by my grandparents' hands. I learned how to spell by reading seed catalogs. I learned math by measuring fence posts. And the most important lesson, how to be a good person, came from watching Grandpa wash his truck every morning and Grandma leaving warm bread for the milkman who always ran late. At my real home, if you could call it that, everything felt cold and sterile, like a luxury hotel. My mother was a real estate executive, always busy, always in a hurry. She hated messy kitchens, loud televisions, and especially hated when I asked childish questions like, "Mom, will you play with me?" After my father died in a car accident when I was 6, she became even more distant. I was never told any details about his death. There were no photos of him in the house. No one ever said his name. Just once when I was 8, I asked, "What did my dad look like, Mom?" She glanced at me and replied, "He didn't leave much behind but trouble." Then she changed the subject. A year after Dad's death, she remarried. Jeffrey had the polished air of a businessman, pressed shirts, perfect smile, and eyes that never held mine for more than 5 seconds. From the beginning, he never pretended to be a stepfather. To him, I was an unwanted obstacle in the wide halls of the new house he shared with my mother. When I called him Uncle Jeffrey, he corrected me immediately. "Just Jeffrey is fine. No need to get too personal." Starting when I was 9, every summer break I was practically shipped off to my grandparents' ranch like a piece of luggage. My mother said it was good for you while signing real estate contracts. But for me, it was the only time I actually felt alive. Grandpa Eugene taught me how to ride horses, how to smell the rain coming through the grass, and most importantly, how to keep my word. "Honor is the one thing no one can take from you, unless you give it up," he told me once when I broke a jam jar and thought about lying. Grandma Margaret taught me to arrange flowers, bake scones, and read people's emotions not by their words, but by their expressions. "A good person is someone who makes others feel lighter just by being near," she used to say. Every morning at the ranch started with the sound of roosters and the smell of strong coffee. I'd help Grandma let the chickens out and pick vegetables for lunch. In the afternoons, Grandpa would take me around the property in his beat-up pickup truck that was older than I was. Those were the rides I cherished the most. He didn't talk much, but every word he said stayed with me for years. Once, staring out at the mountain ridge, he murmured, "Sometimes keeping kindness in your heart in the middle of a chaotic family is the bravest thing a person can do." Even though they lived simply, I often wondered why my grandparents never seemed to lack anything. They didn't wear designer clothes or travel far, yet they were never short on money. I asked once and Grandma smiled, "We save because we know people matter more than things. But that doesn't mean we're poor." I didn't understand then. Not until much later did I realize that quiet simplicity had been hiding a financial empire no one suspected. I only returned to my mother's home a few weeks before the school year started. Those weeks were heavy. I had to behave properly by her standards. Dress neatly, speak softly, never mention the ranch or those two outdated old folks, as she called them. If I dared to bring home a jar of jam Grandma sent, Mom would throw it in the trash and say, "What century are you living in? Industrial sugar's terrible for your health." I used to cry over those little things. And I used to wonder, maybe Mom was right. Maybe I was outdated. Too dreamy. But each time I returned to the ranch, sat beside my grandparents on the creaky wooden swing, listening to crickets as the sun set, I felt real. When I was 16, Jeffrey and my mom had a son. They named him Landon. He grew up surrounded by every comfort: chauffeur rides, private school, birthday parties at luxury resorts. Mom doted on him so much he called her Queen Mom. Me. I was slowly forgotten. But my grandparents never forgot me. Even in their old age, they called every week. Every winter, they sent me a new pair of gloves. Every birthday, Grandma wrote me a 2-page letter full of garden stories, squirrel sightings, and always ended with, "You are still the light of our lives." And now, with them both gone, I stood in that cold chapel, clutching the sealed envelope, and felt all those childhood memories swept away in a sudden storm. Because if Grandpa wrote, "Don't trust anyone in the family, not even your mother," what was waiting for me behind that curtain of truth? The fire happened on a stormy night while I was nearly 40 miles away in my small apartment downtown. When the call came from the fire department, I thought I was dreaming. The man's voice on the line was shaking as if he couldn't believe what he had witnessed. "We found the body of an elderly man in the main house. The house was almost completely destroyed. The fire spread too fast, wind pushing east. We believe it was Eugene Turner." I froze. The town had seen wildfires before, but this one spread unusually fast. Early reports said it might have been caused by a fallen pine tree hitting a power line. But later, neighbors told me they saw strange lights near the barn before the fire reached the house. Some even whispered about seeing a strange SUV driving away around midnight, before police and firefighters arrived. I don't know what chilled me more, losing Grandpa forever, or the creeping suspicion that his death wasn't an accident. The funeral was quiet. No long speeches. No flowery goodbyes. Just a photo of him smiling and his old cowboy hat placed respectfully by the altar. My mother wore a fitted black dress, her face frozen like a marble statue. Jeffrey stood beside her, his hand on Landon's shoulder as if they were the real family. When I stepped up to place a flower on the coffin, my mother turned away. She didn't shed a single tear. All through the service, she whispered something to Jeffrey, occasionally casting heavy, unreadable glances my way. I stayed close to Grandpa's side throughout the ceremony, as if I could hold on to the last warmth of the man who had always been there for me. But what truly stunned me came after. That afternoon, after everyone had left the cemetery, I sat alone in the back row. An older woman with neatly tied silver hair and a modest brown coat approached and sat beside me. She didn't say anything for the first few minutes. Just stared toward the grave, her thin hands laced together. "I'm Gloria Freeman," she finally spoke, her voice calm and low. "Private attorney for Mr. Eugene Turner. I once promised him that if this day came, I would personally hand this to you." She opened her purse and pulled out a thick envelope, carefully sealed with red wax. On the front was my grandfather's familiar handwriting. "Open only when there's no one left to trust." I sat there in silence for several minutes. My hands trembled as I broke the wax, unfolding each page like I was unwrapping layers of truth long buried. There were 3 parts inside that envelope. The first was a 2-page handwritten letter filled with words that made me both choke up and feel completely lost. Adeline, if you're reading this, it means I never got the chance to hold you one last time. I know this will hurt, but some truths must be saved for the right person. You are the last light of my life, the only one I trust to understand why things happen this way. The second part was a stack of bank documents. I had to read them 3 times before I could believe the number printed clearly at the top. $29,470,000, held in a trust account named Eugene Turner, Adeline Turner Trust, managed by a private bank in Chicago. I couldn't breathe. I had always believed my grandfather was just a simple farmer, living on an old ranch with a modest lifestyle. I had never seen him spend carelessly. He drove the same pickup truck for nearly 20 years, used solar panels, and always patched his clothes instead of buying new ones. And now here I was staring at a number I had never even dared to imagine. The third part was the official will, notarized and fully signed. He left all his assets, including the ranch, savings, shares in a renewable energy company called Greenwind Corp., and a lakeside house in Idaho, to me. Not a single mention of my mother Tracy or of Jeffrey or Landon. At the end of the will, he wrote, "Those who chose to leave us behind in pursuit of power and money do not need to be redeemed by wealth they never valued. Adeline, you understand the true meaning of love and gratitude. You know that wealth is not the goal but a tool to spread kindness. So I leave it all to you." I folded the page back, but my heart was pounding. I looked at Gloria, trying to find the words, but all I could manage was a shaky whisper. Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he let me know before?" Gloria slowly shook her head. "He was afraid. Not of you, but of them finding out. Eugene believed that if those people, Tracy, Jeffrey, ever discovered this fortune existed, there'd be no safe place left for it. Or for you." I clutched the envelope tighter, my whole body chilled as if standing in snow in the middle of summer. Everything I thought I knew had been flipped upside down. I didn't know what was real anymore. But one thing I could feel more clearly than ever. I was stepping into a story my grandfather had been silently preparing for me for years. A story that my own blood relatives might never accept. And they wouldn't stop easily. Because to them I was now the one holding everything. I hadn't even caught my breath after reading the final lines of the will when my phone started buzzing non-stop. My mother. Then Jeffrey. Then Landon. One message after another appeared, each one like a sharp knock on my mind. "We need to talk. Now." "What game are you playing, Adeline? You don't have the right to decide that. We're family." I didn't respond. I sat frozen in the old wooden chair in my grandfather's kitchen, the envelope still in my hands, eyes fixed on the foggy window. Outside, the wind swept across the scorched hills, lifting the ash left behind by the wildfire, as if to remind me that nothing was the same anymore. 3 days after the funeral, I received an invitation, if you could call it that, to attend a family meeting at my mother's house. Her message said only one thing: we need to clear things up. I knew what was waiting. But I still went. Because if I stayed silent, they would never stop. My mother and Jeffrey's house was just as I remembered. Spacious, cold, not a trace of memory anywhere. The stone walkway gleamed, the thick wooden door stood still, and the soft yellow lights from the high ceiling lit the place like a stage. When I stepped in, they were already seated in the living room. My mother, her face stiff but her lipstick perfect. Jeffrey, arms crossed, and Landon sprawled on the couch, phone in hand, not even trying to hide his boredom. My mother spoke first. "Adeline," she said, her voice completely flat. "I just received word from someone named Gloria Freeman. You've been given a will of questionable origin." I looked at her and nodded slowly. It was from Grandpa. Written and signed by his own hand. With witnesses, notarized, and presented by his personal attorney. Jeffrey let out a mocking laugh. "Come on, this isn't some soap opera. No one hides a $29 million fortune and hands it over to a schoolteacher making $30,000 a year without telling the rest of the family. Does that even sound real to you?" I didn't answer. I knew the mocking had just begun. Landon suddenly leaned forward, took off his sunglasses. "Who do you think you are? His only grandchild? I'm part of this family too. I'm the child from Mom and Jeffrey's legal marriage. I have a right." I turned to him. "Have you even been to the ranch once? Do you remember Grandpa's full name?" Landon shrugged. "And what makes you better?" Some loser obsessed with chickens and zucchini patches? Now you think you're in charge just because you've got money. I clenched my fists trying to stay calm. My mother cut in, her voice colder. You're creating chaos. He wasn't in his right mind. That estate shouldn't go to one person. We're family. And family shares everything. Shares. I looked at her, speaking slowly. Then why for all these years did none of you ever check how he was doing? Never visited, never called? When he died, who arranged the funeral? Who stood in front of his ashes? Not out of duty but love. Jeffrey interrupted. This isn't going anywhere with talk. We've hired an attorney. If you don't cooperate, we'll take it to court. My mother looked at me with a mix of anger and pity. Adeline, I don't want this to get ugly. But you don't understand the consequences. The media will catch wind of this. Your reputation, your job. Everything could be affected. I let out a dry laugh. Not loud. Just bitter. What do you think I do for a living? I'm a teacher, not a politician. The only reputation I have is with a bunch of ninth graders learning about the Civil War. Landon flicked open his phone again, then held the screen up for me to see. But do you have any idea how social media is reacting right now? The hashtag greedy is trending. Some say you abandoned your family. Others say you manipulated your grandfather to steal from him. Mom chimed in. And if Gloria Freeman is real, then we'll pursue this legally. If needed, we'll bring in a notary, investigate the accounts. We're not going to let everything disappear because of a letter and a few sentimental lines. I didn't respond. Because I knew in their eyes I was no longer a daughter. No longer a sister. I was an obstacle. A barrier. The one standing between them and that massive fortune. As I stood up to leave, Mom murmured under her breath, "You're disgracing your grandfather." I turned to look at her one last time. No. He left everything to me, because he knew exactly who I am. And he knew exactly who you are. I walked out of that house with nothing but a fragile belief that I was doing the right thing. But when night fell, I truly felt it, like a knife finally slipping through the skin. I had lost my family all over again. Not because I wanted to, but because they never truly saw me as one of them. And this time they wouldn't stop at words. I returned to my apartment that evening, my head still spinning from everything that happened during the family meeting. Every word my mother said, every sneer from Landon echoed in my mind, clashing into a dull roar that wouldn't stop. I shut the door and leaned against it for a long time. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't play any music. The apartment was eerily quiet, even though I'd always found it peaceful. I walked into the living room, dropped my bag and froze. Something was off. One of the photo frames was tilted. I'm not a perfectionist, but I remembered clearly straightening it before I left that morning. There was no reason for it to be out of place, unless someone had touched it. I moved closer to the console table and examined the surface. A faint scratch, barely noticeable unless you were looking. My heartbeat picked up. I checked the main lock, no signs of forced entry. Windows still locked. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe I was exhausted, paranoid from everything that just happened. But the next morning I found something undeniable. While changing a flickering bulb in the bedroom, I noticed something reflecting light from above the closet. A small glint in the ceiling corner. I grabbed a chair, climbed up, and felt my blood run cold. A tiny hidden camera, no bigger than a fingertip, was embedded into the wooden beam. I froze. Didn't dare touch it. Then something inside me snapped. I tore through the apartment, checking every corner, behind pillows, in the bathroom, even inside the bedside lamp. I found 2 more cameras. One in the living room. One in the kitchen. There was no doubt now. Someone had broken in. And they wanted to watch my every move. I packed up in under 15 minutes, grabbing only the essentials. Documents, my phone, some cash, and the letter my grandfather left me. I walked out without locking the door. I didn't even look back. I didn't know if I'd ever return. The next morning at school I was barely functioning. I tried to teach like everything was normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing at the door every time someone passed in the hallway. Part of me was afraid. But another part hoped for something more concrete. Something that would end the guessing. Around 10 a.m. while I was prepping materials for the next class, a middle-aged man walked into the faculty office. He was dressed plainly. Old brown jacket, salt and pepper hair, sharp eyes that somehow weren't threatening. "Excuse me," he said in a deep, calm voice. I'm looking for Ms. Adeline Turner. I looked up. I'm Ms. Turner. What's this about? He gave a small nod. My name is Frank Keller. I was the private financial advisor to Eugene Turner, your grandfather. I stood silent. It took several seconds before I could speak. You knew my grandfather? Not just knew. I was the person he trusted most for the last 10 years. I invited him into the empty classroom next door. We sat across from each other. His hands had old scars. And when he began to speak, I knew I was face to face with someone who held pieces of the puzzle I still didn't understand. Eugene always knew there was a chance his daughter, your mother, would betray him. Not because he was paranoid, but because he saw it early on. The way she abandoned you only came around when she needed money, pressured him to sell the farm. Eugene remembered everything. I clenched my fist. You're right. But why didn't I know anything about him? Frank looked at me for a long time before answering slowly. Because Eugene wanted to protect you. And he knew that once it was revealed you were the heir, the people around you would change. I already received the will, I said. And I thought that was clear enough. Frank shook his head. No, Adeline. That was just the surface. You haven't seen the full picture. He pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. This contains a map of hidden accounts Eugene created under a series of shell companies. The total assets are far greater than what's stated in the original will. My eyes widened. You're joking. I'm not. And there's one more thing. He took out a thin folder. On top was a petition for psychiatric evaluation. Tracy tried to have Eugene committed. Last year. She signed it along with Jeffrey. The goal was to have him declared mentally unfit so they could transfer the assets without his approval. I trembled. He never told me. Because he didn't want you to worry. But he fought back. He recorded the entire conversation with Tracy. And he gave me the recordings, in case we ever needed them. Frank looked at me with a heavy gaze. And now that time has come. I couldn't speak. My throat was tight like a block of ice melting slowly in my chest. Frank gently placed his hand on the table, leaning forward slightly. Adeline, your grandfather spent his entire life preparing to protect what he believed mattered most. Not money. Not land. You. I bowed my head, feeling like I was losing him all over again. But it wasn't just pain. It was clarity. Because I knew I couldn't step back anymore. I couldn't just hold the will and hope it would be enough. He hadn't just left me an inheritance. He had left me a war. And I wouldn't fight it alone. Frank picked me up early the next morning, while the schoolyard path was still blanketed in mist. His old pickup rumbled gently, and the inside smelled like aged leather and the faint aroma of coffee from the paper cup he held. We didn't talk much during the drive. Just a soft Brahms symphony playing on the radio and the crunch of gravel as he turned onto a narrow dirt road deep in the woods. This used to be Eugene's spot when he needed quiet, Frank said, eyes fixed on the road. No one else knew about it except for one other person who passed away last year. I nodded, feeling a quiet mix of anxiety and gratitude for having him beside me. The cabin came into view after a bend in the road, nestled between tall pine trees. It was small, maybe a little over 300 square feet, but solidly built, with thick curtains on the windows and a long wooden bench out front, covered in dry leaves. Frank pulled a small ring of keys from his pocket and unlocked the worn black metal padlock. When the door opened, a wave of dry pine and old paper rushed out, like a sealed archive of time long untouched. He called this the memory room, Frank said as he stepped in first and pulled the overhead light cord. I followed him. Shelves lined the walls. A walnut desk sat by the far window. In the corner, a small safe. On the desk were an old voice recorder, several folders, and a stack of notebooks marked with colored tabs. Frank opened the safe carefully and pulled out 3 plastic boxes. Inside were memory cards, hard drives, and a thick pile of printed photos. I reached out with trembling hands and picked up one of the navy blue notebooks, flipping to the first page. My grandfather's handwriting was still so familiar. Neat, straight, consistent. Just like the way he lived. April 12th. Tracy called again, asking for money. This time it was for an orphan relief fund. But I checked, she transferred 80% straight into Jeffrey's account. I don't know if I'm more disappointed or foolish for thinking she could ever change. I flipped to another page. It held notes about meetings, withdrawal details, dates and times, even transfer memos. June 5th. Gloria warned me again that Tracy is collecting signatures to have me committed. The plan's all too familiar. Fake dementia, then seize financial control. I'm not even surprised anymore. My chest tightened. I couldn't imagine how long he had endured all of this alone. Frank powered on a small projector in the corner. He slotted in a memory card and pointed to the screen on the wall. You need to see this. The footage was nighttime, recorded from a hill overlooking the disputed plot of land on the west side of the farm. Two figures appeared, a woman in a long coat and a taller man in a baseball cap. They carried gas cans, pouring fuel around the base of trees, then lit it. Flames shot up within seconds. Frank paused the video and zoomed in from another angle. The woman's face was clearly visible in the firelight. It was my mother. This is undeniable evidence, Frank said slowly. The date, the time, the images. And the audio. He played the next clip. Tracy's voice came through, low but clear. If that land burns, its value drops and Dad will have no choice but to sell. You just handle the paperwork. Jeffrey replied, I've got it. But are you sure the old camera is dead? Tracy chuckled coldly. He installed it himself years ago. I already pulled the old hard drive. No one has a copy. I sank into a chair, clutching the notebook so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every suspicion, every dark intuition I'd had, was now proven. Frank placed a hand on my shoulder. You're not alone, Adeline. Eugene prepared everything. You just have to bring it to the right place. We returned to town before sunset. I called Gloria and asked for a private meeting that evening. Her office lights were still on when we arrived. She greeted us with a more serious look than usual, then led me into the small conference room in the back. I laid out all the materials: photos, video, audio files, documents. Gloria said nothing for the first 20 minutes. She only reviewed, took notes, occasionally furrowed her brow. At last she looked up, her voice steady. We have enough grounds to sue Tracy and Jeffrey for asset embezzlement, trust fund abuse, intentional property damage and financial fraud. I'll file the case with the county court this week. I nodded silently. Gloria looked at me, her brown eyes reflecting a quiet sadness. Eugene didn't trust you just because you were the only one who loved him, but because you were the only one strong enough to stand firm while the rest of the family fell apart. I couldn't hide the emotion rising in me. And now it's your turn to protect him. I woke up at 3:13 a.m. to a soft noise, like the creak of a window. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It carried an intentional edge that my body recognized before my mind did. I didn't turn on the light. Didn't move right away. I just cracked my eyes open, staring up at the dark wooden ceiling, listening. Another sound. Light but heavy enough to chill my spine. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. From inside the house. I slid off the bed quietly, bare feet silent on the old rug. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but it was gone. I opened the drawer and pulled out the small key my grandfather gave me as a child. The key to the old storage room at the end of the hallway, where he used to hide important documents. I stepped backward toward the door, opened it slightly and peeked through the gap. A shadowy figure stood in the hallway. Wearing black, baseball cap on, holding something heavy that looked like a canvas bag. He didn't call out to me. Didn't say a word. Just stood there, head tilted slightly as if listening. I pulled back, locked the door, then turned to the old wardrobe. Behind it, a small panel. An entrance to the storage room my grandfather had converted from an old coal closet. I slipped through and locked it from the inside. I don't remember how long I sat in that darkness. Arms around my knees, breath sharp, sweat soaking the back of my shirt. I tried to use my phone, but the signal was weak. Almost no reception. I dialed 911. 2 short rings. Then silence. No answer. No error. Just dead air. I stayed in that space until the world outside went still, and the faint morning light seeped through the cracks in the door. When I returned to the bedroom, the house was empty. No sign of a struggle. Nothing broken. But the back door near the kitchen was ajar, the hinge still swinging faintly. And only one thing was left out of place. A photo of my grandfather and me, removed from its frame and placed face down on the table. I didn't go back to the bedroom. I packed a few things and left while it was still barely light. Once I got into the car, I called Gloria. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. On the third call, a stranger picked up. A woman's voice, choked and panicked. Are you a relative of Mrs. Gloria Freeman? I'm her client. What happened? She was in an accident early this morning. The car veered into a ditch off the highway. We suspect brake failure. She's currently in emergency care at the county hospital. Felt like all the blood drained from my body. I turned the car around and drove straight to the hospital. When I arrived, Gloria was still unconscious. A nurse told me the doctors were monitoring a minor head injury, but thankfully she was alive. What chilled me was what the officer on duty at the scene said. They found evidence of brake tampering, loose bolts and a clean slice through the brake line. Clearly intentional. There was no doubt anymore. Someone was trying to erase the evidence. And I was clearly next. Frank called me as soon as he heard. Take everything Eugene left behind. I'm bringing you to someone who can help. I met him an hour later, gripping the file bag so tightly my hands had gone pale. Frank led me to a small house on the western edge of town, where rose vines covered the porch and pale blue paint peeked through the green. A small brass plaque by the door read, Judge Grace Williamson, retired. Judge Williamson opened the door, her sharp eyes gleaming behind round-framed glasses. Adeline Turner, she said like she'd known me forever. Eugene spoke of you often. I sat across from her in the quiet living room, trying to steady my breath as I handed over the files. Frank remained standing beside me, his gaze steady. Judge Grace flipped through every page, every photograph, bank statement, audio recording and video still. For nearly 30 minutes she said nothing. Then she looked up. This is enough to bring both Tracy and Jeffrey to trial. But you'll need someone to verify the legal validity of all these documents, especially Eugene's mental competency at the time of drafting the will. I swallowed hard. Is there anything to prove that? She gave a soft smile. Luckily there is. Eugene asked me to conduct an independent mental capacity evaluation when he updated his will last year. I wasn't just a witness. I kept a full copy of the medical assessments and a video of the signing session. Frank straightened. You kept all of it? My attorney did, she replied. And it only gets released if there's risk the original materials might be destroyed. What happened last night and this morning is enough for me to act. She pulled a sealed envelope from her drawer, stamped with the county court insignia. Give me the rest of the materials. I'll secure them where no one can touch them. And when we go to court, I'll testify. I couldn't speak. I just bowed my head and handed her the file with both hands. I left Grace's house with Frank, feeling lighter but still knotted with unease. From now on, every step I took had to be careful. Because they weren't just using words anymore. They were ready to erase me. And I couldn't let them win. That morning, I sat on my grandfather's cabin porch, holding a cup of coffee I had brewed at 4:30, unable to sleep. Fog still clung to the burned tree-line in the distance. The cabin was no longer a hiding place. It was now ground zero. Frank placed a stack of papers in front of me. Inside was the media strategy we had drafted over the last 2 nights. With Gloria, even while she was still recovering. Right in the middle of the top page, the title was bolded. Public Press Conference. The Turner Family Scandal. Conspiracy to Seize Assets, Charitable Fraud, Deliberate Property Destruction and Emotional Abuse. I folded the paper gently and set it on my lap. Are you sure? I asked. Frank didn't answer immediately. He sat beside me, looking out at the empty driveway where Eugene once parked his old pickup. You once asked why your grandfather never came forward sooner, he said. He wasn't afraid. He just had hope that his daughter might change, that the family might realign after all the pain. I stayed silent. But there's no one left to hope for now, Adeline. The truth has to be told. And you're the only one who can tell it. We held the press conference on Saturday morning. I chose to do it at the farm, on the porch, where I once sat listening to my grandfather read, where my grandmother once placed fresh apple pie on the table. Frank contacted local media and a few major outlets in Denver. The district attorney's office was invited to send a representative. Judge Grace Williamson agreed to make a brief statement, verifying the documents and her role as an independent witness. I stood behind a small wooden podium, spine straight, chin up. The morning sunlight lit the scorched marks on the trees behind me, a visual reminder of how this all began. In front of me stood nearly 30 people, including journalists, legal officials, and a few neighbors who still remembered who Eugene Turner truly was. Cameras rolled. Red lights blinked. Microphones slid into place. I began. My name is Adeline Turner. I'm the only granddaughter of Eugene and Margaret Turner. I grew up here. On this land, I learned how to speak honestly, keep my promises, and look people straight in the eye. I glanced directly into the lens. And today I'm doing all three. I laid it out piece by piece, from the will to the attempts by Tracy and Jeffrey to declare Eugene mentally unfit, to the evidence of misappropriated orphan trust funds. I played the audio recording of my mother and Jeffrey planning to set fire to the disputed property. I played the video. I showed financial documents bearing both of their signatures. This is no longer a private family matter, I said clearly. This is crime. It's fraud, it's corruption, it's destruction of property. And I will not stay silent. I stepped back, giving the floor to Judge Grace, who spoke calmly and confidently, affirming the full legitimacy of the documents. Then came the representative from the district attorney's office, Mr. Harrison Bell, who announced, "We are officially opening a criminal investigation into Mrs. Tracy Carter and Mr. Jeffrey Carter for actions that appear to constitute financial crimes and intentional destruction of private property." The press conference lasted just over an hour. But less than 3 hours later, the internet exploded. Headlines flooded major news outlets. Billionaire's daughter accused of embezzling orphan fund. Heir exposes family with shocking audio clip. Who set the forest on fire? New footage reveals it was a family member. Stock in Jeffrey's company, Westbridge Capital, plummeted by nearly 17% within 24 hours. Investors pulled out en masse. The company's board announced the suspension of his executive authority to protect the firm's image and interests. That evening, Tracy appeared on a national news show. She wore a pearl-colored suit, sat up straight, eyes glistening with the look of a misunderstood mother. Holding the anchor's hand, her voice trembled slightly. "I raised Adeline the best way I knew how. But she always lived in her own world, creating these fantasies. Now she's obsessed with the inheritance, thinking everyone is out to get her. It breaks my heart to see my daughter in such a mentally unstable state." I wasn't surprised. Frank called me the moment the show ended. "You holding up okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," I replied. "I've gotten used to being the odd one in this family." Frank let out a quiet breath. "Prosecutor Bell just sent a message. They've requested subpoenas. The formal investigation starts tomorrow morning." I sat on the porch steps, the night air cool around me. The house was quiet, but I wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time, my grandfather's home no longer felt like a place to hide. It was where I stood my ground. For him. For myself. For the truth he protected until the end. I entered the courtroom with freezing palms and a throat so dry it ached. White lights glared down on the press row already packed with reporters, their recorders blinking like watchful eyes. The door closed behind me with a hard thud, a sound that felt like crossing a point of no return. Tracy sat at the opposite table, posture straight, hair pinned into a flawless bun. Jeffrey was beside her, expression cold as if everything was still under control. Next to them was a gray-haired man whose face had graced several major financial magazines. Mr. Taft, a top-tier attorney known for defending Wall Street giants. The way he adjusted his cufflinks told me he was here to finish me off. With words. My lawyer, Gloria, even though still recovering from the accident, arrived in a navy coat, round glasses, and a firm stride. Behind her was Frank, never more than a step away from me, and Judge Grace, now seated in the gallery, her sharp eyes tracking every move. Presiding over the hearing was Judge Veronica Lindley, a veteran of complex inheritance disputes. She read out the involved parties, then raised her hand to begin the hearing. Tracy's side opened by accusing the new will of being a forgery, presenting handwriting analysis from their own expert who claimed the signature did not fully match previous documents. They also submitted an older will, notarized in 2003, naming direct legal descendants as heirs, a vague phrase that could mean anyone their lawyers decided. I sat still, listening to every barbed word from the woman who gave birth to me. Tracy called me a child living in her own fantasies. a pawn manipulated by Eugene to punish his biological daughter. She added, "I'm not after money. I just want to preserve the honor and memory of my parents, before it's tainted by an outsider." Then Gloria stood up. "If Mrs. Tracy Carter considers Adeline Turner an outsider, I'd like to remind the court. This entire estate was granted to her not because of blood, but because of trust." She played a video Eugene had recorded before his passing, his face calm. "She grew up under my care. She kept her word. She never betrayed me. She understands what life is worth. And she never once asked, 'What do I get for taking care of you?' He just did it. To me, no one is more deserving than Adeline." The courtroom fell silent. Jeffrey looked down. Tracy clenched her jaw. But before she could respond, the courtroom doors suddenly opened. An elderly man with white hair and a slight limp stepped in. He wore a faded brown suit and leaned on a walnut cane. The judge asked for identification. He raised his eyes, voice raspy but clear. "My name is Benjamin Walsh. I'm here to explain why Eugene Turner named Ms. Adeline his legal heir." The air in the room shifted instantly. Both Tracy and Jeffrey turned sharply. He was called to the witness stand. Gloria looked at me cautious. I had no idea what was happening. Benjamin slowly opened an old leather wallet and pulled out a yellowed envelope in my grandmother Margaret Turner's handwriting. "Eugene was the man I respected most," he said, his hands trembling around the letter. "But here's something few people knew. Margaret and I had a deep relationship before she married Eugene." I froze. "We parted ways due to circumstances, but we never lost contact. When Margaret became pregnant, she wasn't sure who the father was, but Eugene chose to raise the child as his own. That child was Adeline's mother." Gloria stood. "Do you have proof, Mr. Walsh?" He nodded, retrieving a DNA test from the inside of his jacket, issued by an independent lab in Illinois, confirming our biological connection. He also presented a series of handwritten letters between him and Eugene, where they discussed protecting me from Tracy, someone they both recognized early on as dangerously ambitious and emotionally unstable. Judge Lindley called a recess to examine the documents. I stepped down, head spinning. Benjamin came closer, eyes gentle. Something about them reminded me of Eugene during his quiet moments, just watching me sketch on the porch. "You don't have to call me father," he said softly, "but you should know, Eugene made the right choice. And today I came to say thank you for preserving his honor." I couldn't speak. I just knew that the will everyone once called a distorted picture was finally revealing its first clean lines. And somehow I was the one holding the brush to redraw justice for myself. The Jefferson County Civil Court issued its official ruling on Friday morning, after nearly 3 tense weeks of proceedings. Inside the courtroom, no one made a sound as Judge Lindley spoke. "The will signed on July 15, 2022, authored and certified by Mr. Eugene Turner at the office of Attorney Gloria Freeman, is hereby recognized as valid, free of coercion, forgery, or diminished capacity. All assets, real estate, and shares are awarded to the sole heir Ms. Adeline Turner." I didn't stand. My body felt cemented to the bench. Gloria gave my hand a gentle squeeze and Frank simply nodded, like he'd known all along. Across the aisle, Jeffrey clenched his jaw, eyes fixed straight ahead. Tracy didn't turn around. She sat still like a statue. And Landon was nowhere in sight. A court staffer whispered to Gloria that he had left the courthouse before deliberations began without saying goodbye. The day of the verdict passed like a slow news broadcast. Reporters crowded the courthouse gate. Several local stations aired the ruling live. When I stepped outside, only a few microphones were raised, but I said nothing. I just stood there in the autumn wind, looking out at the distance where the trees had begun to turn golden brown. 2 days later, the state prosecutor officially launched an investigation into Tracy Carter on suspicion of trust fund abuse and intentional endangerment through arson. Jeffrey faced charges of money laundering and embezzlement from the charitable foundation he had once promoted on national television. And Landon, images of him drunk and smashing furniture in his old dorm room flooded the internet. No one defended him. No one spoke up for him. One Sunday afternoon, I returned to the old farm. The gravel path still wound toward the gate. The wooden swing still hung under the birch tree behind the house. No more campfires. No more Eugene laughing when I dropped my ice cream on the porch. I walked past the kitchen, opened the old cupboard where he used to hide his homemade strawberry jam. Only empty jars now. I placed my hand on the window frame, touching the faint scorch mark that still lingered on the wood, where flames had once reached before a late rain put them out. In the distance, the field of foxtail grass had grown back green and full, but there were no more hoofbeats echoing across the hill at dusk. I now held ownership of all of Eugene's real estate, a bank account totaling $29 million, shares in a clean energy company based in Colorado Springs, and several properties scattered from Wyoming to Montana. I had a team of private attorneys, a professional asset management firm, and even a standing offer from a major newspaper to publish my memoir. But I had no family left. One evening, I quietly opened the wooden box my grandmother used to store letters. Inside was an old birthday card, its paper yellowed with age, her handwriting slanted and warm. A message to me on my 9th birthday. Dearest Adeline, no matter how old you grow, we hope you always live as yourself, not for others' expectations but because you know what's right. Family isn't just blood. Family is where someone misses you when the wind changes. I cried. Not out of loneliness but because I finally understood that a part of my family still lived on, even if it now belonged to the past. The next morning, I sat on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves. A mail carrier passed by, leaving a thick envelope in the box. On the front, from the San Mateo Notary Office. I opened it. Inside were completed documents to transfer Eugene's orphan fund to an independent organization, with one condition: the new trustee must be the person he trusted most. Below was my name. In his handwriting, signed 2 years ago. I smiled gently. Maybe he knew I'd one day be standing alone, and that I'd need a reason to keep going. Not for money. Not for power. But for the children who had never been held the way I once was. For those who had no grandparents to hold their hands through nightmares. I whispered, I'll keep my promise. I won't let this place become an empty house. Then I stood and called Gloria. I want to start with the orphan fund. And the farm. It won't just be inherited land. It'll be a home. For those who've never had one. Founding the Eugene Margaret Turner Scholarship wasn't just a financial decision. For me, it was a way to redeem what was lost. A tribute to 2 people who quietly taught me what kindness really meant. We based the foundation in the wooden building behind the farmhouse, Eugene's former equipment shed. Frank managed the fund's finances. Gloria handled the legal framework to ensure complete transparency. I held only an honorary director role, close enough to stay involved, but without interfering in daily operations. I returned to teaching at Cypress Hill High School, standing again in front of a whiteboard with textbooks and a red marker. The kids had no idea their teacher was worth tens of millions or had once stood trial before the whole country. To them I was just Ms. Adeline, the woman in an earth-toned cardigan with a pot of chamomile tea on her desk. I lived in a small 2-bedroom house behind the farm, with a kitchen and a wooden porch overlooking the fields. I turned down every investment proposal, every talk show interview, and every lucrative book deal. I didn't want to be a symbol. I only wanted to live the way my grandparents had hoped, humble, kind, and useful to others. The first scholarship ceremony was held in early December. Snow had begun falling that morning, dusting the roof with soft white like candy floss. Under the tallest pine tree in the yard, we built a small stage draped in velvet green. Over 60 students from public high schools across the state came. Each of them had passed a tough selection process, not just based on academics, but on their dedication to community and a passion for the environment or history. I stepped onto the stage and looked at the front rows of bundled-up teens, cheeks flushed red from the cold. After a short speech about Eugene and Margaret's legacy, I began calling out the names of this year's recipients. Among them was a girl named Lila Henderson, a senior from a small town called 10 Mile. She wore a worn-out winter coat and stepped up in slightly torn shoes when I read her name. She accepted the envelope with both hands, gripped it tightly, then stayed at the microphone. Her voice trembled. You don't know me, ma'am. But I know you. I know what you've done to keep this place alive, to honor your grandparents. I don't have a dad. My mom's a night shift nurse. Without this scholarship, college would have been a fantasy. But today, you changed my life. The entire yard fell silent. Then applause erupted, so loud it seemed to shake the pine tree. I turned away, but not quickly enough to hide the tears in my eyes. One fell onto my hand, strangely warm in the biting cold. I looked around. In the crowd, I didn't see my grandparents. But I knew they were there. Maybe in Frank's teary gaze. In Gloria's slow nod in the back row. In the wind rustling the trees like a quiet whisper. That afternoon, once the guest had left, I stayed behind to clean up with a few student volunteers. Lila was the last to leave. Before stepping through the gate, she turned and hugged me. She didn't say a word. The hug was brief, respectful, but it carried something so deep I couldn't put it into words. That night, I pulled on a wool hat and coat and walked into the backyard. Snow blanketed the path. I followed it down to the old fence overlooking the hill, where Eugene used to sip his morning coffee. The moon hung high, casting silver light over the glittering snow. I stood there a long time, just listening to the wind and my heartbeat, steady, quiet. And then I whispered so softly it felt sacred, "I kept my promise, Grandpa." What would you do if one day you discovered the person you called family, the one who shared your home, your meals, your trust, was the very person behind your deepest wounds? Would you have the courage to stand up and protect the truth, or would you choose to stay silent and walk away? My story isn't just about inheritance or a courtroom victory. It's a reminder that family isn't always a safe place, but we can build new circles of belonging, ones grounded in love and honesty. Sometimes the greatest thing we inherit is the strength to forgive and the bravery to live truthfully. What about you? If you were in my shoes, would you choose peace or fight for justice? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story because everyone has something they've never said out loud. And if this story touched your heart in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can keep following these emotional journeys about family, memory, and the choices we make. The stories to come might stay with you long after the screen fades to black.